Isaac is married to Rebekah. And this Rebekah is the wife that Eleazar found for Isaac based on the requirements that were given to him. And those requirements was that included the fact that she could not be from among the Canaanites. She had to be from among his people. And before setting out, Eleazar prayed and asked God for a sign. And the sign was that the woman who would be at the well and who would be willing to not only provide water for Eleazar, but also for the 10 camels. Now, there were lots of women at the well because that's what the women did. That was their responsibility to draw the water. So the woman who would give not only water to Eleazar, but would give water to those 10 camels was the one that would be the wife. And Rebekah was that person. Also, we talked about Isaac and Rebekah being types of Christ and his church, because Eleazar brought Rebekah to Isaac, which symbolized the church being the bride of Christ. And we also talked about the servant being a type for the Holy Spirit and the church. So when we come tonight, we pick up the fact that Abraham, remember Sarah had died, and so now it comes to the end. When we read chapter 25, we have come to the end of Abraham's life. Abraham is in his final years. And Abraham again takes a wife, and her name was Keturah. Now, she had 6 more sons. So even though, and Abraham is certainly old, much older than what he was when he first started this journey, but after Sarah died, he took another wife. Now, when I was reading and studying, some suggest that Keturah was one of Abraham's concubines that he may have just married, but she had 6 more sons for Abraham. Also, during Abraham's final years, he gives his final blessings to Isaac and to his other sons. Now, remember that Ishmael was Abraham's first son, which by right, according to the Eastern culture, he should have gotten the birthright. However, the birthright or the blessings were to flow through Isaac. However, when Abraham died, he wanted to make sure that his other sons got something also. And so Abraham he sends Keturah's sons away to the east, which was around Arabia. And we're going to see a map of that pretty soon. But he sends them to the east. He dies when he was about 175 years old. Now you're going to see in your Bible around, let's see, 25 verse 7 and 8 says that Abraham lived 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last breath and died at a good old age, an old man and full of years, and he was gathered unto his people. Now that phrase, you see, a man full of years not only speaks to his age, but it speaks to he had achieved an inner shalom. Now that word shalom we know means peace in the Jewish tradition, but it's not just peace that means absence of conflict or absence of war, but it means that everything is what it should be. Everything is as it should be. He was content. He was satisfied. He had completed his journey. So it says that Abraham was full of years. He died with an inner shalom. He was content and he was satisfied. Now, Ishmael and Isaac worked together to bury Abraham in the same cave where Sarah was buried. Now, remember early on, Ishmael was sent away with his mother. Remember Sarah after he was born, and then when Isaac came along, she thought that Ishmael was mocking Isaac and she didn't want any conflict, so she told Abraham to send Ishmael and Hagar away. But we find that Ishmael is back on the scene and he works with Isaac to bury Abraham in the same cave where Sarah was buried. Now, even though Ishmael came about or was conceived under not so good circumstances, God, through Abraham, did not forget about Ishmael, which reminds us that it does not matter how the child is conceived, the child is still a gift from God. And so God wanted to make sure through Abraham that Ishmael was going to be taken care of. So when we look at chapter 25, verses 12 through 18, we see that we have a little information on the life of Ishmael, what has happened to him, how God has fulfilled his promises to Ishmael. Now, Ishmael produced 12 sons, just as Nahor, which would have been his uncle, and Jacob did, which would have been his nephew. So that number 12, which would be, remember that 12 is going to come up with the 12 tribes of Israel and also the 12 disciples. So when we start studying the Bible, we will see that there are certain patterns, and it's really a lot easier than if we just understand the patterns. There's a lot of repetition in the Bible because it is all connected. So once it's kind of like what we call the law of the first mention. How did you hear that or read that? Where was it first mentioned? And so if you go back to the beginning where it was first mentioned, each time you see it, it's going to tie back to the original. So Ishmael produced 12 sons. Jacob will have 12 sons, which will become the 12 tribes of Israel. And then we will see also the 12 disciples, because each one of these little stories tie up to the bigger story. So if we can see on the map that, and hopefully you can see where I'm pointing, where Arabia is, this is where Ishmael's descendants, or he was at in Arabia, and you can also see the land of Midian. Now this is going to come to play later on. This was southeast of Canaan. This is southeast of Canaan. And remember, Canaan is going to be the promised land. And this is exactly why Abraham did not want the wife to come from Canaan, because just think, if Isaac is living under the premise that this land is going to be theirs, and his people already living there, there's going to be some conflicts. So to avoid the conflicts, and also because they did not believe in Yahweh, the one and true living God that Abraham's family did, she could not come from this area. But I also want you to see, as this story continues, that as we keep going on, we're going to see the Red Sea, that all of this is going to come into play as we continue going on with our story. And not far over is Egypt. This is going to all come into play. Pastor Green, I see you're trying to get in.
Well, my hope is as we look at the geography that surrounds this family, and if we can fast forward it to today, all of Abraham's children are blessed. The Jews have the money, and those who move to Arabia and Ishmael, they have the oil, the gas, and the minerals. And so any way you look at it, nature has provided for Abraham's family in every generation. Even though we see this is going to be a very dysfunctional family as we unfold the rest of this story, it's still people like us that God worked through today. Not perfect people, but people willing to do God's will. And I think it's a good layout when you start looking at the 12. They were shouting the other day about 12 gates in the city. I say, this is interesting. Those who do horoscope, they look at their horoscope piece, you know, the stones, the names. Yeah, the Bible is full of information that we will unfold bit by bit as we stay focused on Abraham's family. And now we're dealing with his son, and then the next generation, then the next generation to come. So it's going to be quite a lesson for us the rest of the night. I'll be listening.
Well, thank you. Not only listen, but when you feel the need to add, please do so. So as Pastor Green talked about, and when this is really going to come into play as this story unfolds tonight, when we talk about Isaac's descendants, as we know as the twins. But this is where Ishmael was. He came to, this is where his descendants in Arabia. This is going to really take a big chunk of our lesson tonight. We're going to see how this unfolds. Now, what we need to know is that Ishmael lived 137 years, and then he was gathered to his people. When you see that phrase "gathered to his people," means that he died and he was buried. He was buried among his ancestors. Gathered to his people means that he was brought to his ancestors. He died and he was brought to his ancestors. He lived 48 years after Abraham's death. So when we get to Genesis 25:19 through 24, we see that Isaac marries Rebekah at the age of 40. They were 40. He was 40 years old when they got married. And we are going to start seeing some repetition. There's some patterns. There's some repetitions. Isaac pleads with the Lord because Rebekah is barren. Well, we have seen that before, right? We've seen that before with Sarah. Now, when we look at 25 verse 19, we see this is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Isaac. Now remember, I told you previously that when you see that phrase, this is the account of, and this is a literary device to let us know that there is getting ready to be a change in the story. Some new characters are going to be introduced. A new character or new characters are going to be introduced. So it says, this is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Armenian, the sister of Laban. And Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. Now we have seen this before with Sarah. God says, okay, I'm going to make Abraham the father of many nations, and it's going to come through Sarah. Well, if this was going to take place, and if God was going to keep his word, then Sarah was going to have to get a baby. The promise could not stop with Isaac. Therefore, Rebekah would have to be able to conceive. Now, Isaac is going to experience God for himself. Isaac and Rebekah are going to experience God for himself. Sarah and Abraham, they come to know God in that he's a promise keeper through their experiences. Isaac and Rebekah will come to know God in their own experiences. It does not matter how much someone else tells us about God being a promise keeper. Until we have gone through our own experiences, we can't fully appreciate that. You know, we hear it, but until we have experienced it, then we can say, not only have I seen, not only have I heard, but I know. So Isaac prayed to God on his behalf of his wife. And again, remember, being barren was an embarrassment to the husband, because the husband, being the man, was looked upon by his status was about his heirs and his property. So remember, Abraham left property, going on God's word that he was going to get land. The same is the case for Isaac. So if God is going to bring this to pass, Rebekah is going to have a baby. So he prayed, and she became pregnant. And it says the babies jostled. She had we would say a problematic pregnancy. It was a lot of struggle, a lot of turmoil. It was just like, from what I'm told, when the baby is constantly kicking, it was just like a war going on in her stomach, because the babies were constantly moving, constantly warring. And so God says, the baby that you have, when she asks, why is this happening to me? He says that you have two nations in your womb. Now, two nations, as we continue on all the way to this 21st century to this day, August the 17th, 2015, these two nations are still warring. So God tells her, you have two nations that are in your womb, and basically they were fighting in the womb. He tells them, now, this is what's going on. You have two nations in your womb. Two people from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. Now, notice he uses the word people, and not one baby or one child will be stronger than the other, but one people will be stronger than the other. So God is still talking in nation talk. He's still talking about Abraham being the father of many nations. And so now he says, this is the start. You got two nations, and this is the start of this war, even that we are experiencing right now in the Middle East. And I would venture to say that no matter how many peace treaties are signed, it is a spiritual problem more than anything else. Pastor Green.
The truth of it is, anytime outsiders interfere in a family fight, somebody's going to be hurt, and normally it's the outsiders. We just don't learn that lesson very well. That we're focusing on biblical principles and traditions that have been around for thousands of years, and we claim we're going to make a democracy out of people that were born into a kingdom and a clan and group without ever realizing this is an old form of government that exists in the world long before the United States of America exists. And when we interpret the Bible with our Western lens, we miss a lot of the principles and truth that's being told in this story. God knows the end of the story. He see people, he see nations, he see generations of people, and we see a pregnancy with twins. Big difference. We've already said when you see a people, a nation, that these twins are just the beginning or the seed that is planted to make this come to pass. A friend of mine used to say, and I picked it up years ago as a boy, in every seed there is a forest. Every seed, one seed has a potential of a forest. One seed from Isaac, two different nations. One starts with the Edomites, the other with the Israelites. And they kept multiplying. And now, as you made it plain, Isaac prays first that his wife conceive. Isaac wants children. Now he pray again and about the struggle that his wife is having, and he tell him, hey, we got two nations. Don't need any trickery. I've already destined that the older will serve the younger. There will be two different people, two different nations. But how often do we come on the scene, don't know the purpose, don't know the end of the story, and we use our games and our trickery to short circuit and trying to advance a cause. And that's how we get wounded sometimes. It's beautiful to watch how it play out in spite of family favoritism, dysfunctional family, one parent showing favor over another, one child with another, and how my child versus your child, his attitude versus his attitude, you know, the little things that cause family pain, especially for Rebekah, because it caused her to die without seeing one of her boys again, you know. So it's a tearjerker, and at the same time, hopefully, we learn that Abraham's children are still fighting, and the rest of us need to stand down and not get too involved with this plan that God put in place before we got here. Thank you, babe.
Certainly. And so again, we've seen this play out before, right? When Ishmael and Jacob. It's a repeat. It's a repeat. Ishmael was born first, even though he was born out of circumstances that went against God's will, or Sarah trying to help Abraham out, help God out by putting Abraham with Hagar to produce Ishmael. By right, by the culture, he should have been the first, the one who got the blessing, the one who got the birthright. But because it was not God's plan, he did not get it. So we're going to see the same thing play out this time. Twins were delivered. The firstborn was red and hairy, and his name was Esau. And the second one was named Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when the twins were born. So after years of marriage, Isaac must have felt that history was repeating itself, which it did seem like that. God had made promises to his father Abraham, promises of becoming a great nation with their own land of great fame and a blessing to the whole world, brought about by the birth of a Messiah. Those promises had been passed on to Isaac, and he had been married for 20 years, no child, and all of God's promises hung on a slender thread that he needed a son. And Isaac prayed and God responded. So these twins are born under these circumstances, war going on in the womb, and thus we have the introduction of family tension, more dysfunction in the family. As Pastor Green had talked earlier, it couldn't have been no more dysfunction that was going on in this family. But again, it was not about the family. The family was only the vessel for which God was bringing about his ultimate plan. It could have been any family, but for some reason, he chose Abraham's family. So with this family, it shows much of, and we hear of this today. Perhaps we are known as the favorite child, or our siblings are the favorite, are considered the favorite child. And people like to say, well, I don't like one more than the other. Perhaps the jury's still out, but there is a perception, even if it's not true. But there is tension in this house, and it shows the favoritism of the parents. Jacob and Esau's different interests and ambitions influenced their parents so that they gravitated towards one or the other. Instead of a family unit, we have a family which is becoming increasingly polarized. Now, there's something interesting right there, is that the children, the twins, Jacob and Esau, were just being who God created them to be. However, one was more of an outdoorsman, that was an adventurous type, and the other one was kind of like a homebody, a tent dweller, just kind of like stayed at home. So each parent gravitated to the one perhaps that was more like them. Because let's face it, we tend to, and today we got this phrase, that's my mini me. We hear that a lot from parents. That's my mini-me, to say that's the one who looks like me. That's the one who acts like me. Now, consciously or unconsciously, I believe that we gravitate toward the one who acts like us or looks like us. And this is what happened in this family. And from that, the children began to sense this difference and began to play off of it. The truly amazing thing is that God plans to work in and through this domestic tension, and at times in spite of it. He plans to shape the life of a man on whom he has set his love and through whom he plans to vet his purpose of salvation for the world. Again, despite the problems within this family, or even put your own self in it, despite the things that you do or I do, God still works through us, because it's not about the vessel. It is about God's ultimate plan. So, 2 children, 2 nations. Like Sarah, Rebekah was barren. She had a child after 20 years of marriage. They had a struggle. In verse 23 says 2 nations. This is going to be continual conflict. They have different strengths, and it's a role reversal. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first, so to speak. Isaac and Rebekah choose favorites. Jacob chose the mild-mannered homebody. Was the mild-mannered homebody, and Esau was the skillful hunter. He was adventurous. He was, athletic. Are there any questions? Please stop me if there are some. If you have any questions. Or...
No, not a question, but maybe a statement.
Okay.
What Jacob did, not Jacob, Isaac did, that was really interesting. Isaac liked the outdoors and wildness, while his wife, one who was around the home, helper, he was handy. And the picture comes to me is almost what you said earlier, but if a person is around and parent have multiple children, as I do, I discovered, and it's worth remembering, that each one is different. Thank God I discovered that early in my life, and that they must be allowed to be themselves, which there will be some characteristics and traits and just natural things in each one that's different. And when I discovered being different was not deficient in my own life, it helped embrace the children and help them to develop to be their own person without playing to the strength or weakness of another. And it worked out real well as I look back being an older person, to engage in their activity and whatever their purpose and gift was, help them to develop that gift. So everyone's unique with their own uniqueness, and there's a tremendous amount of peace when they can be themselves, and we don't have to manipulate children as this mother did. Heard what her husband say, heard this man think he's dying, he's almost over for him, and now with trickery. And I guess that's the best word I could use for it. With trickery, deceive the younger son and say to him, whatever the sin is, that sin will be up on me. And so it caused a real rift in the family, the way she cheated Jacob, whose name was Trickster, he'll catch a cheater. They gave him that name, so he's living up to what they gave him. Esau, whom the man of the outdoors, he living up to his name. Both had a place, but God had already said the older will serve the younger. And you pointed out to us earlier, Sherry, whether we understand it or not, we need to wait on God and see how God is going to make it play, or with God's going to work it out. But in this case, they didn't wait on God. It created problems, and then they had to live with their problems. Thanks.
Certainly. As the story continues, and we've talked about by right, according to the culture, the firstborn son became the father's heir. But God overruled the custom by his supernatural revelation. I have come to accept and understand that whenever culture hinders God's plan, then God's plan overrules. We may have different, when we talk about the culture even of today, just because the culture says something, or man's, and we would say the law of the land says we can do A, B, and C. Well, if that goes against God's word or God's plan, then God's plan for God's people should overrule the laws of the land, especially when they clash. Now, that doesn't mean that we go and break the laws of the land and just do what we want to say and go to court and say, well, okay, well, it's God's laws. But when it comes to our morals, and when it comes to things that we know that we have some say in, and we are given a choice, then God's law should overrule culture. So in this case, the firstborn son would become the father's heir, according to the Near Eastern culture. However, God says, no, the first shall be last, the last shall be first. But the family's response, depending on if it was Isaac or Rebekah, demonstrated their faith or lack of it. The main point is God's faithfulness and power in bringing to pass what he had promised. Again, goes back to the trickery or the deceitfulness or the helping out God. The same thing with Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. So when we say there's nothing new under the sun, there is nothing new under the sun. It may take a different form, but if you pull back the layers, you get to the same old, same old. Okay. So the twins, as we've said, Esau became a nomadic hunter. His name sounds like the Hebrew word that means hairy. Jacob's name sounds like the Hebrew word that means heel. They symbolize two different ways of life, which would have been typical for Palestine at this period of history. Some people were known for hunting. Some people were known for, I call it, tent dwelling or staying close to home. They were two totally opposite people, which the two nations which would eventually come. As Pastor Green had said earlier, each child had their own distinct personalities, but the parents entered in and played upon those according to their own wishes and desires. Pastor Green?
That happened because of favoritism. I don't know how it does. It did, but it does. Rebekah, just like Jacob, you know, he's around the house, he's smooth. Most history said he was a handsome, good-looking, disciplined, kind, gentle man. Now that's history. The others say Esau was more of your outdoorsman, rugged, rough, tough, could take it either way. And so his daddy liked my boy outside, mama liked my boy inside. The hurt come when she delivered those twins. And whoever the midwife was that helped her with them, they said that Jacob came out holding on to Esau's heel. His hand was grasped around his heel. They call him heel catcher, supplanter, trickster. So in his name, it would say, be careful when you're doing business with Jacob. You could come up short. And so at the time when Isaac thought he was about to die, he was sick, he was old, and he called Esau in and told him he was going to bless him, but he wanted him to first go hunting, kill a deer, and cook some stew and bring it to him. And with that being in mind, the custom was the oldest get the birthright. And that's what Isaac was about to do for Esau, giving the birthright blessing. But when he got back home from a hunt years earlier, he was hungry, and he sold his birthright for a bowl of stew. He promised his brother, what good is a birthright if I'm dead? I'm going to starve to death. So the impulse of something right now, instant gratification, he's literally sold his birthright to his brother. And when his daddy got old, sick, mama heard him. It takes a lot of courage to tell your son, go kill me a couple of young goats, skin them out real pretty, bring me the hair, bring me the meat, and I'm going to cook some stew for your father. And while the stew is being cooked, I'm going to cut this hide, and I'm going to wrap this hide around your neck, your shoulders, your arm. I'm going to make you feel as woolly as your brother. And then you're going to put on your brother's clothes to smell like your brother. And you're going to tell your father this big lie. That's some kind of woman telling her son what you're going to do. And he said, what if I'm cursed? She said, may your curse be upon me. And when his brother come back, the deed was done. And when you read this story, it sounds so sad, as Esau is saying, Father, you don't have another blessing. You didn't have but one blessing. Can you still bless me? Finally, his daddy said, you will live by the sword. You will live man of the wild, of the outside. You will serve your brother. And but still, you're going to be blessed. And sure enough, he got blessed. So as we see how this thing unfolded, it was time for him to go back home, but you don't mind me fast forwarding this part of this story. I mean, fast forward, it was time for the brothers to get back together after 20 plus years, nearly 25 years. Jacob left home under a death threat with the most difficult traveling companion in the universe, that of a guilty conscience, having wronged the family, leaving under a death threat, and not knowing if he will ever see them alive again, all because of his mother and father showed favoritism between the two and trickery, not knowing if they'd ever see each other again alive. And that's how he left home. Everything he had in a knapsack, a sack on his back, on the road, headed about 500 miles away, no state police, no SUV, no map, no 9mm, no Glock, just a staff, a stick, and his clothes in a bag. All because the parents tried to get ahead of each other. That sounds so sad, doesn't it? But that's the way history unfolds it.
Okay, we've talked a lot about a birthright, but what is a birthright? The birthright was the privilege of being the chief of the tribe and the head of the family. So the birthright was sold. They gave up the privilege of being the chief of the tribe and the head of the family. And what this meant for Isaac's family was that the person who would have the birthright will carry on, the blessings of Yahweh's promise, which included the possession of Canaan and covenant fellowship with God. This would be the person who would continue that path to get to the promised land. The birthright also included a double portion of the inheritance. So not only did you get your part, but you got a second part. So everybody else, I would assume, would be cut a little bit short in order for the person who was to have the birthright to get a double portion. And it also brought privilege of being the spiritual priest of the family. So when you think about what was given up, this is what was sold, all because of impulse, all because of someone trying to help the process out. So it wasn't just like some simple thing when we talk about the birthright, but it was something of privilege. So when we continue on talking about Jacob being the chief, Jacob grew up in the family home and examined his prospects. He must have felt frustrated. He was destined by God for blessing. His mother would have passed on God's message that the older would serve the younger, but his father had no time for him. All of Isaac's attention was on Esau. As Pastor Green said, Esau was a man's man. He was a outdoor type. And Pastor Green put it mildly, but we would sometimes call Jacob a mama's boy. At home all the time, in the house, mama probably pampering him, spoiling him. He was a mama's boy. But did Esau possess the abilities that Isaac wished he himself had possessed? Every day, as I am dealing with the patients that I'm dealing with on the psych unit, as you listen to their stories, I don't care what it might start out being about, for lack of a better word, about cars, their jobs, or anything. But if you really stay with them long enough, it gets back to the childhood. And if you keep talking to them, they'll start talking about what they perceive their place in the family. I'll be the first to say, as the oldest grandchild in my family on both sides, it came with special privileges, something that I didn't ask for, but it has caused conflict down through the years. And just about a week or so ago, my brother, out of some things that we were discussing, one of my brothers brought it up. Well, you know that you were the favorite. And I'm like, God, are we still talking about that? But you know, for them, it was it was their reality. And so this is kind of like the same thing that was going on in this family. And perhaps in your own families, whether you admit it or not, there are some hurt feelings, something that you may not talk about, but if you really look into it, you can travel back. There's something that happened along the way that you were labeled either the favorite or you labeled somebody else the favorite, and you carried on. But sadly, many parents who have failed in particular areas then try to live their lives through the achievements and performances of their children. I've heard and you've heard many parents say, well, my child is going to have better than me. They're going to get all the things that I could not get. And you know, it's in their mind, they're doing the right thing, but sometimes it doesn't always pan out like that. It causes problems later on. So what was...
Oh, sure, if I might.
Yes,
The problem was they had to divide. Jacob had to leave home. Now he's gone. He was not back for his mother's funeral. That was sad. He was away. So she died, never making closure with him. Isaac, on the other hand, was not aware of Jacob's well-being or welfare and all of Jacob's success with his trickery when he ran into his uncle. And then at the end of the story, how when God brought the two brothers back together, how Jacob sent gifts after gifts of animals and his wives and children and their children to Esau, and he heard Esau was coming to meet him with 400 armed men. The reunion was he left home crying, promising to kill him. The reunion was the joys when they came back together. Esau saw Jacob, they saw each other. Esau run, they met, they hugged, they cried, they wept. And later they buried their father. But they were so much, they had so much, until Esau said to Jacob, you take what side you want, I'll go the other way. I have long forgiven you. He had forgiven his brother. And he served his brother, he helped his brother. He had forgiven him. They both forgiven each other. Part of the problem you just mentioned that we need to remember is even though we have problems in dysfunctional families as we come along, the joy of forgiving and making up, the joy of the reunion, the joy of coming together to be a friend, a source of love and strength. That's awesome how they come back together to be friends before they died, even though they left home young men angry. They came back older men with family, wife, children, and some of everything, and how the two of them loved each other. It's a good ending to the story when we fast forward it a bit.
Okay, yeah, you have fast forwarded, and we're going to get there in a couple of lessons. But I just want to capsulate what this deception looked like. That Jacob said that he was Esau. He included God in his lie. He put goat skins all over his hands to make him hairy so that his father would think that he was the hairy one. He again claimed to be Esau. He gave food and wine as Isaac had asked Esau to do, and he wore Esau's clothes for his smell, and then he betrayed with a kiss. Now, where do we see that at betrayed with a kiss? We're going to see that again in the New Testament. Remember, things just keep repeating in the Bible. It just keeps repeating. Betrayed with the kiss. Does anybody remember where we see that phrase at? Betrayed with a kiss? Where would that come up at?
Yes, that comes up in the New Testament when Jesus is betrayed with a kiss.
And who did that?
Oh Lord, I can't think of his name right now. Give me a minute.
Anybody want to help her?
Judas.
Judas. Okay, good deal. Again, things just kind of like repeat, and once we know that and see those things, it just makes it so much easier. So I'm gonna just kind of like fast forward a little bit, since Pastor Green kind of like took us there. But this whole thing was about the satisfaction of the moment. How many times have we been on a journey and says and we're kind of like almost there, but it still seems far away, and so we just kind of like give up and say, okay, I'm just going to accept this. I'm just going to be satisfied with what I got. I'm just going to be satisfied right now. And so this is kind of like what happened here in this story. The words eat, drink, and be merry sum up Esau's philosophy, which encouraged him to let spiritual matters slide. But they also describe many in our own age and some within the church. Esau was not a heathen. He had not been raised in an idolatrous environment. He was the son of Isaac, the grandson of Abraham, men who had firsthand experience of the true and living God. If anyone ever had an abundance of spiritual advantages, it was surely Esau. Yet Esau sold that birthright for the satisfaction of the moment. As do many today who also have the advantages of prolonged exposure to Christianity. They have heard all about the cross of Christ, but have rejected God's provision. And so the question is, are you like Esau, missing the grace of God, missing what God has for you in order to get something quick, to be satisfied, for the moment? And I would venture to say that, we've all been there. We're just going to let something slide for the sake of feeling good right now. So what lessons can we learn tonight from the story of Jacob and Esau? I would say is that be careful what you give away. You never suffer in vain, and a promise is a promise. And just remember that all Abraham had was a promise. All Isaac had was a promise. And at the end of the day, even though Jacob, there was some trickery going on, Jacob will only have a promise. Sometimes that's all we have is a promise of God. And so we have to make up in our minds not to give in, not to give up just for the satisfaction of the moment.